And the underlying message of this video is that necessity is the mother of invention. Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a model showcase video for this 1/72nd scale Israeli Merkava Mark II main battle tank. The model that we have here is built for my own personal collection and it's not for sale and or purchase. However, as I often mention in these build videos, I frequently take on commission build projects from models ranging between 1/35th scale and 1/6 scale. Although this model here is outside of my normal working purview, if you are interested in the scales that I do offer commission build services in, I can be reached via the email address listed below, which is info@EastCoastArmory.com. This model here is built predominantly out of the box. However, I did go ahead and make one or two slight little upgrades to it in order to enhance it to the condition that we see here. In this video, I'm going to be going over these upgrades as well as giving the model a thorough in-box review. So stay tuned because there's going to be a bit of info coming right at you. To kick this video off, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. And this vehicle here is the Israeli Merkava Mark II main battle tank. As I mentioned in the other Merkava video, the Merkava is an indigenous tank designed by the country of Israel. The vehicle itself was based upon the Centurion, where the Israelis really liked that vehicle based on the performance they experienced in both the Six-Day and during the Yom Kippur War. However, they saw some need for improvement. Also, the Israelis wanted to get into making their own tank design so that they are not reliant on external countries for support. And essentially what they did was they took the Centurion and they bullpuppized it. They moved the transmission to the front and the turret to the rear. And the vehicle originally was adopted by the IDF in the late 1970s and entered production shortly thereafter. Just like with most military equipment, after the vehicle is adopted and is actually fielded and seeing service, it doesn't take very long to see some areas of improvement for the vehicle as a whole. And that's exactly what happened with the Merkava. Fast forward a little bit to 1983, and several modifications and adjustments were designed for the vehicle to enhance it further. Some of the changes that were made to the vehicle, externally speaking, were with the external armor. So, since the original Merkava was designed, they deemed that the armor protection could have been improved, and so applicant armor systems were developed and bolted to the side portions of the turret. Some other changes also involved a redesign of the tin work. The original tin work was pretty much flush with the sides of the vehicle. However, the new design was going to incorporate a leaf spring suspension, and the tin work itself was going to be suspended on this type of a system. More likely, this was done to give just added protection to the vehicle, as well as also some more durability. The vehicle also had some automotive upgrades where the Mark II had some larger fuel capacity, which in turn gave it some longer operational range. And the vehicle also had a new designed automatic transmission, which differed from the Mark I, which had a manual transmission. Armament-wise, the vehicle kept the same configuration and calibers as the previous generation, the main armament being the L7-105, which was again NATO standard of the period, and the vehicle also kept the two FM mags, 7.62mm for the commander and for the loader, and there was provisions for mounting an M.2 HB on the front portion on the trunnion just above the main ordnance. However, the Mark II versions of the Merkava did have an improved fire control system, which again made it a little bit more improved compared to the earlier generation. The vehicle saw service with the Israeli military for a long period of time and saw service in all of the hotspots that Israel was involved with for the last number of decades, most notably, of course, in Beirut and Lebanon. As the vehicle continued to see service, several upgrades were developed for this vehicle to keep it as relevant and in service for as long of a period of time as possible. It wasn't until 2015-2016 or so was when the last of the Merkava 2 units were phased out in preparation for newer vehicles, and the older Merkava Mark IIs were either relegated to be transformed into armored personnel carriers, or they were relegated for reservist duty and were used primarily for border protection. Before we go any further, let's go ahead and take a step back to when the models first started in order to get a good idea on what the base starter kit supplies you with. And here's the model at the start of the build. For the base starter kit, I'll be utilizing this vintage ESCI 1/72nd scale Merkava Mark II main battle tank kit. The model that you see here is a brand spanking new addition to the stash. It literally just came in and there is literally steam coming off it. Well, not so much, but either way, the reason why this one here goes to the front of the line is because I actually need this model in order to complete another build that is currently being built at the same time. I was alluding to this, of course, in the video opener. A little while ago, or I should say shortly before I started this project over here, I went ahead and was building another Merkava tank kit from ESCI, that one being the Merkava Mark 1. By the time this video makes its debut, that one should probably be already posted on the channel, give or take, depending on my editing schedule. But either way, while I was going through that build, it turns out I was missing a extremely crucial bit of equipment that I just can't fabricate on my own. So rather than trying to reverse engineer it and 3D print it, I decided it was actually easier to literally buy another kit, make a mold of the component so that I could cast a replacement resin and get that one built. And also, as it turns out, I could also have another version of the same vehicle in my collection. Fortunately, with the way these Merkava kits are, specifically the ones by ESCI, I now have both the Mark 1 and this one here is going to be built as the Mark 2. So it's kind of advantageous as that works out. Also, as a quick side note, at the time I'm working on this kit here, I'm kind of going through this Merkava building binge, so to speak, where I have not just the Merkava Mark 1 that I mentioned before, but I am also working on a Revell Germany Merkava Mark 3 kit, also 1/72nd scale, so it's again really advantageous that I get this one here and I have both the 1, the 2, and the 3 represented in my collection in 1/72. It truly is interesting how our collections grow from time to time, because chances are really good I may not have necessarily have picked up this kit over here, or maybe I would have after finishing the other 2 kits. Maybe I would have seen this one and be like, let me go ahead and grab it. But regardless, at least I have one now represented in the collection. Back to the actual kit that we have here. This one here was procured off of eBay, and this kit here is a vintage ESCI kit from the late 1980s and the early 1990s. Specifically, this version here was the last release of this kit back in the early 1990s timeframe. As I've mentioned in other kits that have been brought to the table from the same manufacturer, ESCI was a Italian-based plastic model company that was in operation from the 1970s timeframe up until the early 1990s. During that time, they released quite a range of 1/72nd scale and 1/35th scale military vehicle kits. They also produced quite a wide range of airplane kits, however, that's definitely out of the purview for this channel, and video for that matter. Back to their tanks, they produced quite a wide range of military vehicle kits in, again, 1/72 and 1/35. The 1/72 line, originally, that was first released in the early, or I should say the mid and late 1970s, were vehicles from a World War II time period, and then when they entered into the 1980s, they started to tool up a range of modern, quotations, modern era military vehicle kits. Such examples would include the original M1 Abrams, the M60A3, the M60A1, as well as also a line of Merkavas. At the time of release, this was actually probably the first rendition of an Israeli Merkava Mark II vehicle in plastic form. It's definitely one of the first in 1/72nd. The kits were in production from about 1988 or so is when they were originally produced, or I should say the Mark II kit was originally produced, and again, they were in production up until the early 1990s when ESCI themselves would close their doors and eventually all the molds would be sold off here or there. This release obviously comes slightly after the original Merkava Mark 1 release that they also tooled up at the same time, which is a complete no-brainer since they went ahead and designed the Merkava Mark 1. The Merkava Mark 2 is more or less just a product improved version of the Merkava Mark 1, so with just a few little extra components designed and fabricated up, they could go ahead and release it as an entirely new vehicle, which is the one that we have here. It's also important to point out that they had several box art variations throughout the production run of this kit here. In the late 80s and into the early 1990s, a lot of the ESCI kits were brought and imported into the United States from none other than Ertl. Ertl would also do this with not just their 1/72s, but they would also do this with their 1/35s. However, the tooling is 100% Italian and it's molded in Italy. Ertl just basically distributed them in the United States and just through their logo here on the box art. The box art that we have here is the final iteration of this kit until finally ESCI would go ahead and shutter its doors. As for the whereabouts or the status of the kit's molds and tooling, this I'm really unaware of. A lot of the ESCI tooling kits wound up with Italeri, and Italeri would go ahead and release them under their own brand name for the next several decades that followed. This would also happen with Revell Germany, where they would go ahead and rebox a lot of the same tooling kits. However, for the Merkava Mark II, I'm unaware if any of the tooling was acquired by Italeri or if they ever went ahead and re-released this kit. I do know that the Merkava Mark I kit from ESCI, that was acquired by Italeri, and they have re-released it on several occasions. And if you're looking to find one of these kits, it wouldn't be too hard to track down an Italeri counterpart, since that one was in production the most recently. These kits had quite a good distribution to them. I remember them being very prolific when I was a kid. You would go into hobby shops all the time and you'd see ESCI Ertl kits basically everywhere, be it a 172 or 135. This kit here, obviously, those days are long gone, and this kit here I acquired off of eBay, and they are somewhat still commonly found on eBay, and when found can be had for a spectrum of prices. I've seen them retail from the low teens to the upper to low 30s, and anywhere in between. It just depends on who's the vendor and if they claim, I know what I got type of a situation. Regardless, these kits are still fairly prolific and can still be found, but they're not going to be nearly as commonly found as some of the other kits, like I said before, that have been re-released in the subsequent years. The example that we have here is in pristine condition. I almost feel bad opening the wrapper, but not really. I do want to get this thing built. And this one is still in its original shrink wrap. So there you go. You can see the reflection of my chandelier in my filming area. So, yep, this is as mint in box as you can get. The last time this thing was sealed up, I think George Bush the first was the president of the United States. So that was a very long time ago. And I was probably still playing Mario Brothers on an NES. But either way, let's go ahead and crack this one open. But before I do, let me go ahead and remove the cellophane just so that we can get a better view of the box. Otherwise, you can get some nasty glare. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and deplete the number of these kits still mint in box with one fell swoop. Don't want to... There we go. Perfect. Ah, depreciation. You gotta love it.
There can be only one.
With the cellophane removed, and with the cardboard exposed to air for the first time in almost 30-something years, let's go ahead and take a look at the box art. So starting with the box art, we have here a nice illustration of a Merkava Mark II. And as I mentioned before, there were several different box art options for this particular kit. The original, as released by ESCI version of this kit, had the exact same box art, but just some different graphic design on the remainder of the box. As for the quality itself, it's pretty much what you see is what you get, and it is quite literally a Merkava Mark II. The remainder of the graphic design is quite typically seen for the ESCI Ertl kits at the very tail end of production, where we have the name of the vehicle right here in this green banner, and this leads us directly to the ESCI Ertl logo. The ESCI logo is a bit different compared to some of the other ones that we saw earlier, where the font and typeface was much different. All of the kits with this type of graphic design utilize the same type of font over here for the vehicle in question. Here we have... Normally, we would have the different options for decals, and it would show the different countries, but obviously the Merkava is only used by Israel, so you only get Israeli markings. We have some other poignant information right here on the bottom portion, along with the scale of the kit in question, which of course is 172. Signed sections of the box, we have here the end tab. We have a nice little thumbnail of the exact same box art that was on the front, and also we have the kit number, which in this case is number 8338, for those who are interested. Again, more of that same graphic design continued. It is a mirror image on the reverse side. And also on the sides of the box here, we just have some more graphic design. It's pretty simple. Again, it's just basically the same info on the side tab, just carried over for the duration of the side portion of the box. Same thing on the opposite side. On the back portion over here, we have some more verbiage. On the rear panel over here, we just have some corporate information, be it the addresses of all of the different distributors for the ESCI kits, as well as also the warning label that reminds you that this is not a snack and to not eat any of the small plastic parts that are supplied with the kit. And also it has not just in English, but all the other languages and all the other regions where these kits are, or at the time, were distributed. No point loitering on that. Let's go ahead and crack the box open. Just like with all the other ESCI kits in 1/72 scale, the boxes are side opening. And then you can just pour out the contents like you see here. Okay, I'll go ahead and move some of this stuff to the side. So as I mentioned before, this kit is really more or less just an upgraded version of the Merkava Mark 1 kit that was produced by ESCI shortly before this one here made its debut. And so, logically, you will be getting many of the exact same runners, and this runner here being one of them. If anyone can recall back to the other Merkava Mark 1 video where I did the review on, this is literally the exact same runner. And just like I said in that video, the quality of tooling is actually really good. One thing about the ESCI 1/72nd scale tanks is that even though they are as old as they are, they arguably punch well above their own weight, and lots of the molding and detailing for the most part are still good, and they held up very well with age. And this one here is definitely one of those. Bringing the camera in closer, you get to see the upper hull. Note the engine hatch over here has all of those intricate bends and geometric shapes to it, which is something that would be true to form for a Merkava. We have the engine grille right over there. Driver's hatch, which is integrally molded on. Some people may have a problem with that, as some people like to model them in the open position for crew members and things along those lines, but that's not going to be the case with this one here. And then the remainder of the hull is a multi-piece assembly. We have the bottom plate here with the Centurion type lower hull design with that nice little point section. And we also have the two side sections of the armor plate, or I should say of the lower hull, and it has many of the appendages integrally molded on, be it from the final drives to the bump stops, as well as the return roller mounts. Also, one thing that I kind of learned from the other Merkava that I was doing is that a lot of the ESCI 1/72nd scale kits were the Tamiya 135s that they went ahead and painstakingly just scaled down to 172. We saw this with the M48A5 kit, and they also made an M48A3, but this one here definitely has several of the fittings, shall I say, of the Tamiya 135th scale Merkava Mark 1, one of which being the final drives over here where we had that little slot integrally molded on. On the Tamiya kit, that was because this thing was originally designed to be motorized in 135, and so we had that little slot there, but when you make it static, you just glue the final drive over. Well, ESCI, when they went ahead and scaled this thing down, they went ahead and left that little channel right over there. The channel does absolutely nothing on this kit. It's literally just there. So that is definitely a carryover or an appendix, shall I say, from the Tamiya counterpart. But whatever, either way, the quality of the moldings are still very good. Here you can see the suspension springs right over there. The quality of the molding on the springs is fantastic. We also have some MGs right here. We have a Browning M2. We have the FM mag, another FM mag, as well as the mortar. Carrying on, you can see the gypsy rack. It is a multi-piece assembly. The grills are nice and finely molded, which is going to be great when you assemble the whole thing together. It's going to have some very nice detailing. Also, on the rear portion over here, you get to see the rear plate. It does have some details integrally molded on, like the stretcher right over there, but the other details are also integrally molded on and are molded on in a nice crisp manner, which will make painting and weathering a bit easier done. And once the panel line accent goes in there, it will probably make everything shine really well, but that remains to be seen. And that's all there is for this runner here. As I mentioned before, it's literally just rinse, wash, and repeat. And this brings us to the next runner, which contains a mix of the same parts from the other kit, but also the new tooling parts that are required to make this one into the Merkava Mark II. The first thing we're going to go over are the suspension parts over here, and these are identical to the previous kit, and they feature all of the exact same attributes. Here you can see the roll wheels with the hubcap and the bolts and the lug nuts integrally molded on. Even though it's a 1/72nd scale, it's very finely molded, and it's something that will look very detailed once fully painted and weathered. We have here the side lockers with all of the buckles and straps. We have the main 105 armament. It is a single molding, which is great, as I mentioned in the other video. When these Israeli barrels are two pieces, they tend to be a bit problematic. We're trying to do some seam removal on them, but with the thing being one piece over here, it's going to streamline that immensely. We have the rear corner sections with the taillights integrally molded on. The exhaust manifold deflector right over there, nice and molded hollow. It's going to look fantastic once mounted. It's probably one of my favorite aspects of the Merkava series. We have some side skirt mounts here, and we have reason why I had to buy this kit, which were the idler mounts. One of these idler mounts decided to pop off of the runner and just flow away to Lost Party and never to be seen again. This here is why I had to buy this model, and this here I'm going to be taking some very good care of. Basically, I'm going to be having like a Secret Service attaché designated just to keep these pieces from flying away. Once these pieces are molded, of course, then I can finally make the castings, and these can be mounted to this model over here. But until then, I'm going to be really taking care of these parts. Back to the other parts, we have the rear idler wheel with that elaborate geometry that's very T55-ish found on these vehicles. And we also have here the sprockets. The sprockets have a nice tooth type layout that's integrally molded on and are really nicely detailed despite the scale. On that note, we can see the lower hull shackles, the travel lock, and the return rollers. Again, everything is nice and finely molded. The next bit of tooling to look at is the turret, and here you can see the turret's tooling. And if I didn't know any better, I say that this is literally the exact same tooling found on the other Merkava Mark 1 kit. Which, there's nothing to be said negative about that. The other kit has some excellent detailing, and you can see all of those fine details integrally molded on. Be it the hatches, access panels, latches, all that stuff, it's all found on the model's tooling. It's a two-piece assembly, and it's quite customarily seen on many kits out there. And this now brings us to this chunk over here, and this is what makes this kit the Mark II version of the Merkava. So starting with the side skirts are one of the key differences visually between the Mark II and the Mark I, where the Mark I had side skirts that were basically mounted directly to the side of the hull, while the Mark II side skirts were standing off slightly, and they were mounted on these like leaf spring type assemblies, and these would be fitted to the vehicle. As you can see, the leaf spring assemblies are molded onto the side skirt panels over here, and it does give you that proper standoff look that would be appropriate for a Mark II. Of course, we have the mirror image, one for each side, and we also have the other key bit of visual details for Merkava Mark II, which are the applicant bolt-on armor. You can see the armor sections all strewn out here on the sprue, and they have their fastener details integrally molded on, which will look excellent once the thing is painted and that panel line accent goes in there to do its job. On the rear portion of the side skirts, you can see that they properly rendered out the leaf springs in the manner that you see here. And again, this is just going to give just a little bit more of a standoff and a little bit more authenticity to the build. On the reverse side, you get to see some more of the armor sections. And it's going to be really fun to glue these in place. And this now takes us to the part of the kit that I am not a fan of, which are the Caterpillar tracks. And yes, being an ESCI kit, specifically an ESCI kit of the 1980s time frame, this kit gives us the lovely individual Lincoln Lane track. Now, normally I would piss and moan about how much I hate these tracks, which I do. There's no illusion to that. However, on the ESCI kits in the 1/72nd scale range, I'm actually able to put them together and have some decent results with, which I'll go over my technique in this video. But here you can see the track links up close. They do have some pretty good detailing integrally molded on, or I should say detail integrally molded onto the exterior portion of the tracks. However, oddly enough, the ESCI 1/72nd scale kits, specifically from this era, do not have any interior track rendering. This was true on all of the 172s that I built from them, from the M1 to the M60 to the M113. They all have naked inner portions of track, where we have no hinge sections, nor do we have any tooth details. And so anyone that likes to proclaim that individual Lincoln Lane tracks look more realistic than single-piece vinyl, they don't, and here's a sheer reason why they don't. Oddly enough, the ESCI kits from the 70s, World War II kits, had single-piece vinyl tracks, and I think they were better than these ones here, but what do I know? I just like to build these things all the time. The other thing that's unique is that you get two runners of track, which is fantastic. Obviously, you're going to need a bunch of these components, if not all of them, to put together the tracks, and hopefully they will come out just fine. But again, that remains to be seen, and we'll see what that looks like as the video goes on. The next thing I want to mention is the decal sheet. Now, this is something in the past I've had some very mixed results over. The decals on lots of these ESCI kits, again, are pushing past 30-something years now, and for one reason or another, the decals rarely hold up. It's a 50-50 chance I've always seen where if the decals will be able to be utilized on the model. Sometimes they just snap and crumble into oblivion, and other times I'm able to get lucky and get them into the water and then slid onto the model surface. This one here, the decals appear to be in fantastic shape. The paper is a blue paper backing. I've seen these in blue or white. The decal quality itself looks good. I'm holding up in the light. I'm not seeing any cracks or anything along those lines. So that's a good sign, but that remains to be seen. And we'll just have to wait to the end portion of the video to see whether or not these things will actually hold up. Setting that carefully aside brings us to the instruction manual right over here. Simple and sweet. Being a product of its era, this is all old school, hand-drawn, drafted type illustrations. It's basically everything you see is what you get. Yep, that's going to be fun, and I'll definitely be mentioning that as the video goes on. And no, it's not as easy as the way it makes it look like in these illustrations. Link and Link Track never is. Anyone that says otherwise is lying to you. Pretty straightforward, so it's going to be really cool to see how this one pans out. So that's all there is to the ESCI Merkava. I'm going to go ahead, actually, no, I'm not even going to put it back in the box. I'm going to put it in a Ziploc bag, and then I'm going to carefully walk over to the shop where I could get into the mold making process as fast as humanly possible. But no point getting on camera. Let's go ahead and cut across to the next scene. Moving forward a little bit, takes to the tank here, and at this point the model is fully assembled and is ready for painting. So the model goes together pretty well. If anyone's seen the Merkava Mark 1 video, which will probably drop before this one here, it's the same kit, so it goes together identically. The only difference is that this one has some slight modifications with the tarp, with the extra different parts that get glued on in place. Also, the side skirts are slightly different as well. But aside from that, what you see is basically what you get on the other one. However, if you didn't see that other video, I'll just briefly go over. So the model, of course, features individual link and link track, which, as we know, I can't stand. However, on this 1/72 scale kit here, I was able to build them, and they came out as good as you're going to get for a link and link track. One thing I do want to mention, one hack about doing these tracks is that they are not glued onto the tank, or at least not at this point yet. So, as you can see, the tracks are actually in a segment pontoon type format. And with this method, this allows me to overcome the biggest hurdle with individual link and link tracks, besides assembly wrapping around the sprocket. But the other problem that these tracks have is with paint work. Because there's a lot of nooks and crannies in here, trying to thoroughly paint weather tracks when they're built on the model is almost impossible. And it's always funny when I see people doing that. You're going to have missed areas. It's just going to happen on not just the tracks, but also on the suspension itself. Well, one way to mitigate that as much as possible is to do what I did here, where the tracks are in segments. This allows me to paint and weather everything off the model, and I have full access to get into all the little crevices on both the lower hull as well as on the suspension and the track itself. It's not as easy, or I should say it's not as efficient as, say, individual or single piece vinyl, where you just paint it, clip it together, and then stick it on the tank. That's still the best way to do it, but if you are stuck with using these tracks like I was here, the pontoon technique is the best way to go. Of course, after the tank is painted and weathered, at the very tail end, the tracks will be installed permanently at that point, and the model can be progressing to the next point. As for the tracks themselves, the timing is, again, very tricky on individual link and length, and this one here, it's no exception. I was able to get the parts to fit as good as I can get, and you can see that here around the sprocket. That's always the trickiest part on link and length, is where the hinge work needs to articulate around the sprocket and the idlers. And what you see here is the best you're going to get with this type of platform, which is why I will state again, and I yell from the rooftops, individual link and link tracks are dog crap. They're worthless, and that's just the bottom line. But for this one here, they're going to be able to be used just fine. The other thing to mention is with the lower hull itself is a multi-piece assembly, so you have to be careful with the assembly, make sure the glue is properly set. As for the fit, it was pretty good. I didn't have to do any hand fitting so much on the parts, just some light polishing here or there, just sprue removal basically, and then the pieces all went together. You want to take your time, you want to pace yourself when gluing the hull. You want to do it in sub-assemblies where you first do the lower hull by gluing the 2 sections to the lower pan and then the rear plate. Do the bodywork on these sections, polish it down, then install the upper, and then do some more seam removal. On the upper, there's a seam running in this section over here, as well as also on this section over here. Some thin super glue, or I should say some thick super glue on the front, and some hand sanding was done to polish it down. On the back here, it actually lined up pretty well, so I don't believe there was really any body work on that section. As for the suspension parts themselves, they fit on pretty good, but one thing I do want to mention is that the return rollers, the recesses are pretty stiff, so much so that you could potentially break something. I recommend a pin vise on a Dremel, or I'm sorry, a small Dremel bit with a pin vise is going to be in order to just enlarge these holes so that the recesses open up and you can fit the pieces in more efficiently. On this section here, I actually have a little foot loop right there added. The Merkava does have it. There's a recess molded into the front section here for this piece. Oddly enough, they don't give it to you with the kit. This is actually a carryover from when this was actually taken from the Tamiya 1/35 scale Merkava kit, and ESCI did in fact scale it down to 1/72, but they forgot to include that little part. In order to fabricate this, you could make it out of a piece of wire or some plastic. Me, fortunately, I actually have a mold on hand for the Tamiya 1/35 scale M41 Walker Bulldog. I did an OTR on number about a year or so ago, and with the way I made some of the parts, the handles, or I should say the turret hooks were casted or recasted, and it just happens to be a happy accident that it is literally the perfect bit of equipment to also supply you with the foot section on the Merkava in 1/72. So it's kind of cool how that worked out. Once everything's painted and weathered, it's going to be absolutely perfect. It's going to be the cherry on top. On the turret, this too goes together pretty well. Some slight hand fitting, polishing with some sandpaper on the upper and lower sections to get them to properly fit. There is a seam that runs around. The biggest seam area to pay attention to is the one down here near the tarpaulin. You don't want to over sand in the wrong places. But with just some red putty and some super glue, I was able to take care of it. The armor sections go on very easily. There's no real hand fitting required, and it just all lines up pretty well. The one thing I do want to mention is on this section over here, you'll notice that there is a quite prominent knockout mark. Unfortunately, they have it on this side. It would have been fine if they were rendered on the opposite side because it gets glued to the model. But if you are working on this kit, there is a knockout mark here. Just a little bit of red putty and some sanding was all that was needed to get the thing to blend in. On the bustle rack, it is a multi-piece assembly. It's a bit frail. The parts do line up. There's a seam on these 2 sections here. Thick super glue, sandpaper was all that was used to polish it down. But you'll see that one addition I made was to the gypsy rack. I added the mesh work. The mesh is not included with the kit. This was some spare, very fine mesh that I had on hand, and I went ahead and made a template, cut it out, and I glued it in place. This is going to come into effect when it comes time for painting and weathering. You have to be really careful because mesh like this just loves to get clogged up very easily. So that's going to be something I really have to pay attention to. The MG mounts are also pretty nicely detailed, specifically this one here for the Commander. It's a multi-piece assembly. Unfortunately, there's no real lock point how it secures to the model. It's very ambiguous. From what I understood, it kind of locks on in this type of method over here. And once the glue's set, you're basically all set and you're good to go. As for the remainder of the MGs, these are going to be painted off the model and mounted to the model after the thing is fully painted. The last thing I do want to mention is with the main armament. The piece is a single molding, so no seams to contend with, but there is a slight mold separation line between the two. Easily polished away with some sandpaper or needle file or an X-Acto, or in my case, I think I used all 3. The other thing to pay attention to is the alignment. The hole isn't exactly flat, so with the way the upper and lower sections meet, so you have to polish that down with a needle file, make sure you can get as flat as possible. Then when it comes time for the insertion of the tube, you want to make sure that it's nice and true. With the way the tolerances are, it's actually fairly loose, so what you have to do is you glue the piece in place, and then you just want to double check and make sure on all the different avenues that the thing is as straight as humanly possible. If it's canted to the left or right or any direction, it's going to hurt the look of the build. So, and this also, by the way, is true for the Merkava Mark 1 kit, obviously for the same reasons. Jumping forward a little bit, here we have the model going through its final phases of assembly. The model has been painted, weathered, and at this point here, the tracks have been fitted in place, and the side skirts are about to be fitted. While I have them all in this configuration here, I might as well take the advantage to show what the unit looks like before the skirts get fitted onto the model. So Here you can see suspension is plugged on. The last of the return rollers were fitted in place, and the return rollers are painted as they are rubber rimmed on the real Merkava. This was just done with some careful painting with a paintbrush. And it always looks cool when these things are skirtless. So that's why I'm taking the advantage of this at this point. You also get to see the really cool spring details on the bottom portion over here. Those are still going to pop through even when the side skirts are fitted in place because of the cool geometry that these things do have. But either way, you get to see what they look like now fitted. Obviously, the suspension was painted and weathered before it was mounted to the model, as again, it just streamlines and makes painting that much easier on a build like this. And it's definitely the best way to go. Alright, now that you've seen what this thing looks like under the skirts, let's go ahead and make her look a bit more proper. And with the model now fully completed, you really get to appreciate the suspension work with the side skirts now fitted in place. The side skirts on this one here go on, in my opinion, much more easily compared to on the Merkava Mark 1, and this has to do with just the design of the side skirts in general. And the same is true on the 1/35th scale ones. On Merkava ones, there's only a very small place for the glue to be added that holds and secures the side skirts where they need to be. However, on the Merkava Mark 2, because of these leaf spring type housing systems, they offer much wider, broader areas for the surface area for the glue to adhere to, and because of that, generally on these Merkava Mark IIs, the side skirts are fixed in a much more easily state. And on top of that, they tend to be a little bit more robust compared to the Mark I counterpart. Also, unlike the Mark I, where I actually had to do some hand fitting on the front section over here where the tracks extend from the side because they were interfering with the side skirt sections, on this one, I don't think that was a issue. It just was the way this cookie crumbled during the build. That just wasn't a thing that needs to have been done. But there is a propensity of that potentially happens. So if you're building one of these kits and you are interfering, or the fender is interfering with the track with the fitting, you are going to have to do some slight hand fitting on this section over here just so that the things can fit on appropriately. On this one here, I didn't have that issue, but don't be surprised if you do come across that on your own build. Again, it's just truly at the luck of the draw. Just like with the Merkava Mark I, there are certain sections of the tin work that are actually rubber, and on this vehicle over here, they would be the rubber sections found on the front leading edge, the front corner section here of the tin work itself, and also on the rear area where this whole wraparound piece is indeed a rubber section. Another thing that's rubber to keep in mind is this little area right on top of the rear hatch over here. This is a little rubber gasket, and this does need to be painted to replicate that material. And again, it's just a way that to better enhance your build. As for how I painted these over here, this is just done with a little swipe of Tamiya rubber black, and then just a little airbrushing of flat white to get the weathering effects that you see here. On the rubber sections themselves, not only did I paint the outsides, but I also painted the inner sections, and this is done just to ensure that's a nice, thorough piece that's thoroughly painted, and again, it just makes for a more complete build in the final end result. On the side portion here, the Merkava, of course, is iconic to having that large side-emitting exhaust manifold, and I went ahead and weathered it accordingly. Some Tamiya flat black in the airbrush was poofed into this section over here after the side skirts were added in order to get everything weathered in one go. The same thing was also done on the opposite side, as on this section over here, this is another exhaust manifold. I believe it's for either the heater or the auxiliary generator. It's either one or the other if I'm not mistaken. But either way, if you take a picture or look at pictures of these real ones, they tend to have an exhaust soot in this section as well. Back to the rear section, you get to see how everything was painted. So the first thing I want to bring your attention to is the stretcher. As I mentioned before, the model does have the stretcher integrally molded on. The piece is nicely molded with a lot of nice intricate details. However, because it is integrally molded to the rear plate, you, the builder, have to take special care with a paintbrush in order to thoroughly paint the thing and make sure that it's painted properly. I.e., the paint doesn't run all over the place, nor is it too thick. As I often mention, those are the two ways you can get screwed when using a paintbrush. The pieces were painted accordingly, where the canvas section is painted with olive green. The handle sections are a little swipe of aluminum or steel paint. Hopefully it comes out in focus right over there and there. And also the end connectors would be rubber, so a little swipe of black or rubber black is suffice. On the reverse side, you get to see the fire extinguishers right here and here. Again, some careful precision painting was done with a little swipe of Tamiya flat red in order to get the results that you see. The other thing to mention, of course, is the taillights. And just because it is 172, that does not mean that the taillights are going to be painted incorrectly. So the Merkava just uses the same exact taillights as the other NATO pattern vehicles, namely the American ones, where the top section is a cat's eye, and that is red on the left-hand side. A little swipe of silver is for the rear light directly below. And on the reverse side, it's gloss black, with again the bar light being silver. As for how to paint those, obviously this is some very tight precision painting, and your best fine paintbrush is going to be required, or you can even use a little piece of wire or a toothpick. Whatever it is, as long as it's precise and you can get the paint where it needs to go and nowhere else, that should definitely be able to do the trick. Skipping back to the front takes us to the hull itself. Like I mentioned before, the hull is a multi-piece assembly, and you want to take your time when you're building it and putting it together. You want to make sure the glue's properly set, and you don't want to rush it. If you do that, you're going to have issues of alignment and also fitting issues. And if you take your time, the thing should go by mostly effortlessly. On the front area specifically, there would be a seam in this section over here, as well as on these two vertices, again, and how all the panels line up. And as you can see, the front section was easily addressed with a little bit of thick super glue and some sandpaper, and I was able to polish it down to the seamless look that you see here. The tow hooks are stock out of the box. They carefully get glued in place to the appropriate locations, and you can also see that little bulldog lift hook that I mentioned before, and again, it just blends in absolutely seamlessly with the remainder of the detailing. Another thing to mention is the periscopes right here on the driver. A little swipe of gloss black was added to the 3 periscopes. Again, precision painting is going to be a must on this, and once they are properly painted, it just makes the build look that much more enhanced. Moving up takes us to the turret, and the first thing I want to mention are the spare track links that we see mounted on the sides here of the turret, while on the other Merkava kit, I think that they were mounted on the front and rear portions of the hull, and this is, from what I understand, one of the changes that were made to Merkava Mark II. The one thing I do want to mention is that the track links are the kit supply ones, of course, and with the way the kit is designed with the individual link and lane tracks, you only literally have enough for one tank, so there's no spares, so if you have an oopsie moment, you're going to be screwed. With the way the kit is, if you properly assemble the tracks, you will have just enough spares to outfit the 2 spare sections found on either side of the turret, so 4 track links total. And as you can see, after the track links were painted and weathered, they were added to their appropriate locations, thus flushing out the turret area. Also, as I mentioned before, the rear bin section had its mesh work added, and once fitted in place and painted, you can see how much more enhanced it makes the model compared to leaving the section meshless. As for the mesh, like I mentioned before, this is something that is definitely one that can enhance the build, but if your mesh game is not where it needs to be, you will actually hurt the build. The mesh needs to be very, very fine, of course, the thing being 1/72 scale. Big, large 1/35 scale mesh is not going to be appropriate. And on top of that, you have to carefully cut the thing to shape, glue it to the appropriate location, then you have to paint, weather, and varnish everything, which, if anyone has done that with mesh before, you'll know that it can screw up in any way in any of those locations during the build. And on this one here, I was able to navigate the waters pretty well, and the mesh came out absolutely perfectly. And once fitted in place, again, it just makes the build look that much more enhanced. As for the Gypsy rack, it is a 3-piece assembly, so there is a seam to contend with on each side. Easily done, polished away with some sandpaper and some thick super glue, and at least for the end result that you see here. Of course, the side sections of the turret have the applicant armor fitted in place, as I mentioned before. On this section, you can see the shovel that was also added. This is the kit supply one. This is something that I added after the model was built, painted, and this was painted separately on the runner, off the model, and then it was added at the final leg of the build. This allows me to thoroughly paint everything as opposed to trying to work in these tight confines to go ahead and paint it. Some guys out there like to do it that way. I've done it both ways before, so it's really whichever way you deem fit. Me personally, I like to paint my tools off the model and add them at the very tail end. And there are pros and cons to each. On the reverse side here, we have the marker mortar, or the smoke grenade mortar, and the mortar itself is very decently rendered from the kit, even though it is 1/72 scale. But one thing that you want to pay attention to is how to paint it, and this is something I actually learned from doing my 1/16 scale Hubin conversion of the Turon 5 I did a little while ago for a customer, and the mortar was actually one of the more interesting aspects of that build. So the Israeli mortar, it's more than just a tube, right? We have this small little handle with a gauge on it. The gauge is actually white, and it's a little drop of gloss white right over here, and the handle is a gloss, plasticky, black type color. And I just use a little swipe of gloss black over there to paint it. Even though it's 1/72nd scale, it's just those little devil in the details that really enhances the model. As opposed to just leave everything just painted black, as most people tend to do, or they just overpaint it with the tan. Just like on the other example, the hole was drilled out in the bore section of the mortar, again enhancing it further. If you do not want to drill it out because either you don't have the tools on hand like a fine small Dremel bit or a pin vise, or you're just not comfortable with drilling something that tiny, fear not, you can still pull it off. What you do is you just paint the end section with a little swipe of gloss or of flat or rubber black, as on the real ones they did have a little dust cover that would pop onto the end. So if you are going to render it in that format, you don't want to drill it out, just add a little drop of flat black and you should be good to go. Moving topside takes us to the top armament, starting with the Commander's FM mag. This is a multi-piece assembly, and it is fairly tricky in how it goes together. As I may have mentioned before, and I definitely mentioned this in the other video, the instructions are pretty vague on where the unit gets mounted in place, and there's not really any clear indication points found on the tooling, so you do have to kind of guess and fit the piece in place blindly until finally it finds its sweet spot and it gets secured where it needs to be. And that's basically how I did it. Also, the MGs were painted off the model, and then I carefully added them to the appropriate locations when the time did come. Same is also true here for the FM mag for the loader. And just like I mentioned in the other video, when you're painting these Israeli ammo cans, you need to know that the ammo can itself is in a holder, and the Israeli ammo can holders are very unique and different from the other ones used by NATO. So the ammo can holders used by the Israelis are armored on the front and rear section, and there's this hinged plate door on the top. And when you're painting the can, what you need to do is the only part that would be the ammo can that's visible is this little section right over here on the end. This, of course, would be olive green or NATO green, depending on the can color, or even olive drab. For this one here, I went with Tamiya Tamiya olive green, as I generally do, and it works pretty well. But anyway, only the rear section right over here would be the ammo can that's exposed, and the other sections here would be part of the tank, so they're painted with the same color. And also, again, the top portion, you would have that plate found on that section here. All these details, again, are integrally molded on. You just have to carefully paint them with a paintbrush to make the model shine in its full capacity. Moving forward takes us to the main 105. Again, single piece molding, which is great, no seams to contend with, which on Israeli vehicle with all these straps is definitely something you don't want to be dealing with bodywork for, specifically in 172. So it did clean up very easily. Just there's that mold separation line, polish that down, and you're good to go. Piece mounts pretty well. The one critique I have with the kit is that if you follow or just build it out of the box, the barrel tends to be in a somewhat downward position like we have here. If I was to do it again, I'd probably hit the trunnion section with a bit of a needle file just so that I can bump up the angle a little bit of the barrel, because this thing is non-functional, as you can see. Once you glue it in place, you're good to go. So that's the one change I would do if I was to do it again, but other than that, it does the job quite well. One other thing to mention about the 105 is that the tip section is painted in flat black. This is something that's very commonly seen on Israeli vehicles, and so a little swipe of Tamiya flat black was all that was needed. The other thing I want to mention is the tarpaulin itself. This is nicely molded into the vehicle, and so I carefully painted it with a little bit of khaki drab in order to get that color like you see here. When it comes to Israeli tanks, you do have several options on the colors used for the tarpaulins. I've seen them in tan, I've seen them in khaki color, so just look at some pictures of the real one. There are tons of them on the internet, and you could just work from there. And that's all there is to the detailing. This takes us to the paint and the mark. Straight out of the gate, before the model even saw a little drop of paint, the entire thing was thoroughly primed with flat black spray paint. After the spray paint was added, it was then time to add the base coat. No matter on what brand or what types of paints you're using, be it from Tamiya, Vallejo, if it's Model Master or enamel or acrylic, doesn't matter. There has to be some sort of primer on the surface. It just makes the paint stick that much better, and it just makes the model just look that much better when completed. And this one here was definitely no exception. Again, I like to use just El Cheapo flat black spray paint. Some people out there like to use some specialty model primer. All the power to them, but I've definitely had some excellent results with just rolling with the cheap stuff. For the base coat, I went with the same exterior latex paint that I mixed together a couple years ago to do the Tehran 5 build. On that build, as I mentioned, Tamiya actually has a nice little color chart to mix the appropriate colors in the quantities to get the ratio for the desert tan that was found on the Tehran 5. I made a quick little swatch of that, took it to the Home Depot, and had that expanded into a quart of the stuff, so I have basically enough to paint all of these Israeli tanks I have on the foreseeable future. Anyway, the model was painted in that stuff via the airbrush, and then once the paint was applied, it was then time to add the washes and the filters to it to change the color to the way we see it here. For this one, I wanted to replicate some pictures of several Merkava Mark II builds I've seen on the internet where they looked really, really good, and I essentially just stole their look. And to do that, I of course started with that house paint that I referenced before, the exterior latex, and then from there I started adding the filters. For the filter on this one here, I gave it a wash of Tamiya Khaki Drab, as well as also a cream color before the Khaki Drab went on to get the sun fading effects. After the Khaki Drab was added, it gave it this lovely, rich color that we have here, and it just came out perfect. After the Khaki Drab was added, it was then time to do the weathering, and the weathering is done in my usual format. Diluted Tamiya Flat Black was airbrushed onto all of the surfaces, on the crevices specifically, and on the all the high points, and then from there, the remainder of the weathering was done via the Tamiya panel line accent, went to all the appropriate locations, and on this vehicle here, you have lots of nooks and crannies that stuff loves to enhance, i.e. on the engine grill over here, the engine deck, the grill work, the turret, is specifically being a Merkava Mark II, you have all these bolts over here on the applicant armor. It is a match made in heaven for the Tamiya panel line accent. After the panel line accent was done, I then added my dry brushing effects that gives you the final chipping result that you see on this build here. After the vehicle was weathered, it was then time to get the markings, and for the markings, I used the kit supplied water slide decals, and I'm happy to report that the decals were excellent. Like I mentioned before, on these ESCI tanks, it is a 50-50 chance that the decals will work. Sometimes they do, sometimes they just snap into oblivion. I guess it depends on the age of the kit. This one here, this must have been one that aged very well because the decals went on without any sort of complications. And on this one here, it supplies you with much more markings compared to the Merkava Mark I, where we do have the little V chevrons that are, of course, iconic for Israeli vehicles, but we also have each of these little numbers over here that get added to the tin work, and it's also true on the opposite side. We have the bumper ID lettering right here and here, right here on the front. And we also have two little white stripes for the main armament. Actually, on second inspection, the stripes here on the armament are actually hand-painted. I did not use the decals. I think, if memory serves, I think I tried to use them, but they just didn't wrap around the 105 in a good way. So rather than trying to fight with it, I'm like, screw it, I'll just go ahead and paint them myself. So the stripes on the main 105 here are done with a paintbrush with some flat white exterior latex. Some careful paintwork aside, and the pieces look so good, I honestly thought they were decals. So, take that for what you will. Okay, so after the decals were added, of course, the entire model was coated with the VMS matte varnish, giving for the end result that we have here. Again, I say this on time and time again in my videos, and I'll continue to shot this from the rooftops. The VMS matte varnish is awesome. Absolutely love that product. I use it all the time for good reason. Of course, it would be video malpractice to go through this entire video mentioning the other Merkava Mark I kit that I've done from ESCI and not have it make a cameo. So here you get to see the two side by side. Like I stated before, the two are based on the exact same tooling, and ESCI did essentially what the Israelis did and went ahead and took this vehicle over here and just added some extra parts in order to enhance it. And for the most part, the ESCI kit does the job extremely well. As you can see, some of the differences, again, are with the spare track links and where they are located. On the Mark II, they are on the turret, while on the Mark I, turret is nice and naked, while the spare tracks are located on the front, as well as also the rear. You can also see the difference with the tin work on this variant over here. They are flush with the vehicle, while on the Mark II, they stand out. And in my opinion, they give the vehicle just a big, more of a beefier look to it compared to the slimmed down version on the Mark I. Same, of course, is true in terms of looking all beefy is with the applicant armor added to the turret. While on the Mark I, it's just nice and smooth. It's kind of like comparing the original Lamborghini Countach with the later generation Lamborghini Countach with all the wings and all that other crazy stuff on it. But that's actually a perfect analogy, come to think of it. Also, you'll notice that the two are painted differently from one another. Even though they were both painted with the same base coat, you can see just how much different they look with changing and switching out the type of washes and filters that you can add to the model. This one here resembles, again, more of that Israeli desert sand color that is very commonly seen on vehicles from the 1960s, 70s, and that time period, as opposed to the Merkava Mark II, which has more of a dull khaki look, again, which is something that you would see on vehicles from the 80s into the 90s time frame, and further for that matter. And of course, it feels good to have both of them in the collection. ESCI only made 2 variants of the Merkava, so to have an example of each essentially rounds off the collection. I have literally both represented in the collection, and that always feels good in the grand scheme of things. And at the end of the day, this was a nearly perfect build. There's really nothing much more I could have wanted out of this build that I didn't get from the experience, and that's always fantastic when you have that type of end result. This build here was quick, fun, and problem-free. If the other builds that I work on are as easy as this one was, I would definitely be a very happy person. As I mentioned before, I was not planning on acquiring this kit. I kind of had to do it out of necessity for the reasons that I mentioned previously. However, having gone through the motions of construction and having the end result here on the table, I am definitely not regretting that in any way. This model came out basically perfect, and it's cool again to have this rendition of the Merkava in the collection. One, I now have both of the ESCI Merkavas under my belt and in the collection represented, so that is one portion of the collection that's complete. And the other thing is just that it's just a nice build, and it goes together quite effortlessly if, again, you know what you're doing when it comes to working on one of these older kits. Which is the perfect point to swing us into skill level and recommendations. So, straight out of the gate, if you are a beginner, I can most certainly not recommend this kit for you. No way, not a snowball's chance in hell. Not happening. This is definitely not something that a beginner can tackle. Although looks are definitely deceiving, and it looks like a simple build, it's 172 after all. Can't be that hard, right? No. It's actually quite difficult for a beginner to put together. For first, the Link and Link track, a beginner will be absolutely slaughtered trying to put those things together. They are not fun. They are not easy to do. I was able to do them, even though I have legendary hatred for the individual Link and Link tracks, but with the techniques that I've mentioned in the video, I was able to muscle through, bringing the model to the result that you see here, and it came out essentially as good as you're going to get. But the individual Link and Link track is a skill set that the person needs to have. If you do not have the skill set, it's just not going to work. And as someone who didn't have the skill sets, who built an ESCI kit and several others in the past that have these tracks, I could definitively tell you it's just not going to work out for you. It's going to suck. It's just going to be a mess, and you just don't want to go through that experience. If you are a intermediate builder, well, also back to the beginner builder, the other thing about this kit is that it does require a little bit of hand fitting here and there to get it together. So if you're the type of person that's used to working with modern super kits, where these things are basically designed almost flawlessly to go together with hardly any sort of effort, more or less, this kit over here is definitely one that is going to feel a bit outside your comfort zone because there are some areas that need to be hand fitted by the builder, where you remove a little bit of material here, there, you smudge things a little bit in order to get the thing to fit appropriately. And this type of skill set is, again, something that a beginner is just not going to have. This kit here I definitely recommend for an intermediate builder who's already built a few builds under their belt and they want to try something else. This kit here is definitely one that becomes a viable one. And obviously, if an intermediate can tackle it, so can an advanced builder. The model definitely goes together very well for someone with those skill sets. They may, however, find the kit to be somewhat simplistic in some aspects, being with some of the age of the tooling. Some things are a bit overly simplistic, you could say. But either way, in my opinion, it still builds into an excellent rendition of a Merkava Mark II. And even though some of the parts are somewhat simplified, they still go together very well and give you a good overall appearance of the vehicle in question. Also, I'm unaware if there are any aftermarket sets for this particular kit on the market. This is 1/72nd scale, and to my knowledge, I'm unaware of any sort of specific Merkava upgrade parts for this type of kit in either 3D print or photo etch or anything along those lines. So what is out there, I'm unsure of, but if there is something, an advanced builder can definitely use those to enhance this kit further. Me personally, however, I think the kit is just fine with the out-of-the-box configuration and just work within that purview. And that's all there is to mention about that, and this takes us to recommendations. So one thing that I'd like to mention in these videos, specifically when I work on an older tooling kit, is the kit still relevant? And this one, interestingly enough, is. Even though this kit is 35 plus years old, it's just as relevant today as it was when it first came out all those years ago. As far as I know, there isn't really a Merkava Mark II kit specifically in plastic that's out there that has some more modern tooling. There are some 3D printed SS models kits done in 3D printed resin that are out there on the market, and those more than likely have better detailing than this older kit over here, but from what I've seen, it's arguably a wash, and even though I don't think they did this particular rendition of the Merkava Mark II. So with that in mind, yeah, this kit is still just as relevant today in the year 2025 as it was back in 1988 when they first dropped. Which goes to show you that if you design something properly and you put some decent effort into it, the thing will become pretty much immune and future-proof as years go on. So back to recommendations, straight out of the gate, if you are into the Merkava family, this kit here is most certainly one I recommend. This kit is also highly recommended for anyone who's into collecting modern era vehicles, as well as Cold War era vehicles. If anyone is a former IDF Merkava guy, this kit here I also cannot recommend enough for your collection, specifically if you have the skill sets required to put one of these together. Because the model is 1/72nd scale, I also recommend it for anyone who's into wargaming, and the same is also true again for not just this kit, but also its brother, the Merkava Mark I kit from ESCI. However, unlike the Merkava Mark I kit, which is still with us today, constantly being reintroduced and re-released from time to time, this one here, I don't think that's the case, so this one may be a little bit more rare to come across, even though a decent number of them were produced and the distribution was pretty good. It's not going to be nearly easy to track down one of these kits compared to the Merkava Mark I. But if you could find one and find one for a good price, it's definitely worth looking into. And on that note, I would also recommend this kit for anyone who's into building and collecting vintage model kits. This kit, of course, being what it is, it most certainly ticks the boxes of a vintage kit. Another person who I'd recommend this kit to is anyone who's into Braille scale, obviously being 1/72nd scale. This would fit into that type of collection without any sort of issues whatsoever. Or again, if you're just a fan of Israeli tanks and military vehicles, this kit here would definitely enhance that collection as well. And with that, that wraps up this model showcase video for this 1/72nd scale Israeli Merkava Mark II. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being small scale model showcase videos like this one over here, or the other larger scale project update videos that frequently get posted. Another way to keep in loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of this particular build, as well as photographs of the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been seen on this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again. I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. Till then.